We have to be really clear about how these products work and how they don't work. For me, I feel calling out the obvious things is the best way to get around this. If we're saying that this product is designed for this particular use case, we're expecting problems here, here, and here. By the way, we're also looking to reconcile these problems progressively, and here are our thoughts around it. Yeah, you're going to have some people that are ideologically opposed to being engaged in these markets. You're going to have that for forever, by the way. But I think you're going to win over a lot more by being honest and transparent.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore biodiversity conservation and the environment more broadly and interrogate conventional wisdom for the sake of a more robust case for conservation. I'm your host, Andre Mardo. From time to time, certain concepts rise to prominence in biodiversity conservation circles, and some of these follow in the footsteps of climate change analogues. One such concept is biodiversity credits. Biodiversity credits are a mechanism that allow for biodiversity conservation or restoration activities to derive a revenue stream through the production and sale of a quantifiable unit of improvement in biodiversity. Despite the technical and philosophical challenges involved in trading biodiversity credits, or even defining a single unit, biodiversity credits are being used to offset damages to biodiversity. And given the explosion of private and public interest in biodiversity credits, they are worthy of further exploration. Helping us to explore them is Harrison Carter, an interdisciplinary conservation scientist at the University of Oxford's Biology Department. Harrison has studied biodiversity credits in detail and shares his personal views on this complex topic. This is a fairly technical conversation, but non-conservationists should still find it interesting, and it gets easier as it goes along. We talk about the good and the bad around biodiversity credits, starting with a broad description of the concept.
You really have two components to this puzzle for me. You've got what a credit is, and then you've got what a biodiversity credit is. And I know we're going to go on to talk about offsets later, but that's a nice conflation as well. What a credit is fundamentally how you can derive revenue from doing something. That is how that works from a commercial perspective. In the context of biodiversity, a single unit or a single credit is meant to represent a measurable uplift in biodiversity that otherwise wouldn't have occurred if you weren't there. It's meant to be a positive biodiversity gain, and that can come in the context of restoration, where something isn't where it was before, or it can come in the context of conservation, where something is, but it's under the threat of not being there for much longer. And you can see the comparison here with sort of carbon markets and avoided loss and restoration and these things as well. So that's fundamentally what we're talking about here.
You mentioned offsets, biodiversity offsets. This is something that I'm still struggling with, although it's been explained to me by more than one person. How do you differentiate between biodiversity credits and biodiversity offsets?
We could do this, I think, for an hour, Andre, the difference between biodiversity credits and offsets. And I think for me, at a fundamental level, there's not so much of a massive difference. I mean, the way that I think about this is that offsets are kind of a use case of a broader biodiversity credit umbrella, in the sense that a biodiversity credit is designed, as I said before, to kind of have this measurable, evidence-based biodiversity unit improvement in the absence of what otherwise would have happened. And the offset looks to really commodify that gain against a loss measured in the same currency. And when you look at biodiversity credits as a collective, which means looking at regulatory markets, looking at voluntary markets, you can see that the sales of biodiversity credits are fundamentally for offsetting. It's like 99% of the sales is for offsetting. So you can kind of come to the conclusion that say, as a function of what's being bought, credits are kind of offsets at the moment and how we're thinking about them for the commercial attractiveness. In terms of the definition, it doesn't help that the voluntary markets are trying to call these, don't worry about offsets. They're just impact investments. Because for me, and I think for others who use the word impact kind of quite literally in kind of project evaluation, to say that you have a positive impact implies that you know and you've accounted for the costs that you're having, which means that you're effectively in an offset scenario. So that's a little bit difficult for us. And then fundamentally, and in the kind of the definition of how biodiversity credits can be used, offsetting is a defined use case. So in the very best case scenario, and I really am sympathetic because I think that anyone who's kind of getting into the voluntary biodiversity, or not anyone, but I hope most people getting into the voluntary biodiversity credit space are really well intentioned. It's a really important problem, the fact that conservation doesn't have enough money. It's a huge challenge. It's been a challenge for a while, and it has to be altered. Um, but so long as these things are called impact-only investments and called biodiversity credits, and there's not a really clear distinction, it is possible for credits designed to be impact only in the flavor of not offset to be absolutely used, perhaps unintentionally or against best practice, as offsets.
Mhm.
So the definition and the differences between these things are really important. And not that I'm a particular expert in the mitigation hierarchy, but I know there's a kind of an increasing flavor of thought that, hey, a mitigation only hierarchy only really applies for offsets. But doesn't really. Should be applying to kind of all this stuff. You should be thinking about avoiding things before you're bringing back new stuff. I mean, we know that in terms of private flows for nature damaging investment, 75% of them from the globe comes from private industry, which is reconciled against 18% of positive flows coming from the private industry. And so when you think about, which one has to change, well, they both do. You have to reduce damages and improve benefits. You can't just look at one side of the pie, for me at least. But the side of the pie that has to be changed more, you could argue, is the one which is doing less damage and doing that first.
Mhm.
And I think scaling up the positive investment side is really, really important. And for me, I'm more interested in that just from my background. I think it's perhaps, difficult and really challenging, maybe impossible to kind of get this absolutely right. But just because things are really difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. And perhaps that means that, at least from an academic perspective, that's where we should be spending our time.
Just to push you a little bit on the definition, I realize this might be difficult to answer, but at least hypothetically, how would you describe something that is a biodiversity credit but is not a biodiversity offset? Or is there an example that you can provide of something which qualifies as a biodiversity credit but is not a biodiversity offset?
I think fundamentally, at the market view, when I say that 99% are, offsets, that's as a function of what biodiversity credits are being bought for. There are lots of, and I think most credits on the voluntary biodiversity market are intended not to be offsets. They're intended to be simply, if you're interested in making a contribution towards improving nature in whatever way best interests you, whether it's the restoration of biodiversity or the conservation of biodiversity, then you can buy this and you can take a step in this direction. And it's just, effectively commodified philanthropy that can be set against your branding or your marketing or aligns with your corporate values or whatever it is. And I think that's the intention. There's a fundamental difference in there, which is the word contribution. And this is how we think a very, very simple and kind of quick fix could be, sort of taking lessons from carbon contributions, is credits can be a really valuable way of commodifying where your money goes. Because fundamentally, when you donate to a conservation NGO, perhaps you'd have no idea what that looks like. Perhaps even they don't know what that looks like under the same level of scrutiny that we're expecting from credit markets. And that can be uncomfortable considering that we all know that conservation is really, really important. Successes are prevalent and we shouldn't be scaling it down. But at the same time, conservation practitioners are also known to face really big challenges and really understanding what impact they have. Which means when you bring finance into an industry which is not known for really nailing down, because by the way, it's incredibly difficult and non-obvious, and there's a reason why this hasn't been championed, and there's caveats everywhere around this. But finance is fundamentally like it's designed to scale things. And if things aren't working at that small scale, you could be scaling a problem. And as in many cases, we've seen that be the case. Or you could be selling a really big solution, which is hopefully what we're moving towards here. But fundamentally, to draw the difference, in my mind at least, the voluntary biodiversity credit market, if they were called or used as, we've made a biodiversity contribution in the flavor of a credit, great. If we've had positive impact through buying biodiversity credits, aha, that's less obvious to me because impact implies you know your cost and you're evaluating that relative to your improvement. So for some listeners, this may feel really, really pedantic. And I totally get that. And I can also hear that in my own voice. But fundamentally, when you talk about really important things, the detail is essential. And a contribution distinction for me would be that essential component for a voluntary market.
Hmm. You mentioned carbon markets. It seems that carbon credits are, it seems to me, very often used as, and this is not just the case with credits, but so many things in biodiversity science kind of mimics what's been done in climate science, I guess, because it has the profile that it and the funding that it has. So there's kind of a like an aping after climate science very often. In the case of carbon credits, it seems like they're often used as a, if not a model, then a starting point for designing biodiversity credits. And I'm not sure which of those is more accurate, whether it's a model or a starting point. But what I wonder is, and this does go actually back to the scale issue, is are the contexts of carbon and of biodiversity similar enough to do that? Carbon is, a lot more straightforward than biodiversity is. And what kind of lessons can biodiversity experts learn from carbon markets and carbon credits, if not using them as a model?
I think to be sort of smacking it right on the nose, it's a really, really poor way to think about biodiversity, although I can completely see why it's been done. You have to have a single unit in order to trade things. And for carbon, as you say, like you can do that. It's difficult, but kind of relatively simple. You can then detect that quite nicely from a distance. Biodiversity is obviously not valuable in one way. It's not sort of single, it's not stationary, it's dynamic. Lots of its value is in the fact that it's kind of undefinable in a single unit measure. However, I can really see why single units have emerged because otherwise you have this scenario where perhaps a lot less money goes there and biodiversity needs lots of money. And so you're kind of at an impasse, which is why when we think about offsets and credits and can you really understand biodiversity, I don't think you'll ever have, even with all of the, really interesting and exciting and important developments in technology, a measure of biodiversity. You might get closer and closer, but there's deep uncertainty in that,
Mm.
which as an investor, you should really be looking at. I mean, if what you're buying is a collection of mortgages in a product, you're not sure where your mortgages are at, then if you're buying a collection of diversity, surely you should care about how good that measure is, because it affects the underlying value of what it is you're buying. And especially in the context of like an offset use, where there's overissuance from a particular credit site, where perhaps you kind of get your impact evaluation a little bit skew with, you could be claiming things that just aren't true,
Mm.
legitimizing damages to nature.
Mhm.
So I think that I can understand completely why a single unit has emerged. I can see why the carbon credit is kind of like a use case system. But I think fundamentally it isn't just a case of the carbon credit market or voluntary carbon credit market sort of working well. It's also the fact that that market came under a lot of stick for just looking at your economically efficient way of getting credits pumped out. You have monocultures of fast-growing species, often exotic to that native landscape. And so you can pump out your credits right away, bang, 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 and you make a profit. And private markets finds the way for efficiency. Oh no, that's actually a problem because we have to care about biodiversity here. And like, well, why do we care about biodiversity? And yeah, like perhaps you can have like lump sum areas that are designed for these sort of carbon credit projects where the quick bang for buck makes sense, but you can't do that at a big scale because it impacts everything. It's not a very resilient model. And of course, this affects the permanence of credits, additionality, permanence, leakage, things we care about. And so biodiversity really emerged as well, let's find a fix for this. Let's try and make this better. We know that this doesn't work. And for me, the thing that I love about being in a private development setting is the idea of iterative growth. And for my background, I'm quite comfortable with things going a little bit wrong, or in this case, perhaps a lot wrong, people would argue. And then we reflect on that, we recognize that, and we
Mm.
improve. And that will happen in these markets going forward. At the scale at which that will take place is kind of up for discussion, but it's going to happen. And so biodiversity, I think, really emerged as a solution to a problem in that carbon credit market, but perhaps phrased too similarly for me.
So just to clarify, are you saying that biodiversity credits actually developed as a response to the harm being done by carbon credits through things like plantations, planting of monocultures, of plantations, and what that does to biodiversity, or is that just an example?
That's just an example. I'm not sure that's like the official lineage of development, but for me, that we know that the monoculture approach was a huge critique of credit markets, and so the biodiversity function is a very natural kind of successor which overcomes that. But then the challenge is, well, how you really define what biodiversity looks like, how you measure success, how you sort of measure the long-term nature of it, and overspill. It's incredibly difficult. And if you get these things wrong in the context of, I mean, it's fundamentally a lot easier in a contribution-based model because we're happier with things that go wrong if we're not leveling them against things that we know are going badly. If we're not saying that we've done all this kind of input, essential development work at the cost of biodiversity, but hey, it's okay because we've leveraged it against this, but you don't really know what your biodiversity uplift is, then you're probably going to have a net loss from doing this. And the whole point of this is that you have no net loss. But if one of them is much more certain than the other, and you're not buying, demonstrably more of them to account for it, then you're probably going to have a net loss. So what I'm saying is that yes, biodiversity is a theoretical approach, makes more sense that we support the thing that's more resilient, but it's also an awful lot harder to do. And when you bolt that into the same kind of system, you might have more problems than solutions.
We spoke before the podcast about Martine Maron, with whom I discussed biodiversity offsets specifically, maybe a year ago. I think about halfway through the podcast, I realized that she was not in favor of biodiversity offsets. I'd sort of, and I'd kind of assumed that she was a champion of biodiversity offsets, but rather she's someone who's trying to make sure that an unfortunate necessity is implemented as well as it can possibly be. Is that more or less what your situation is as well, your view of things?
In the context of offsetting, I can't think of a better way of thinking about it than this. You have a necessary evil that you have to do. And I really feel like there's lots of kind of pressure as well because it feels like in many ways, well, this is biodiversity, time in the sun. Let's just cash in on biodiversity. Come on, guys, you've been working on this for decades. Let's pump it up. Let's do it. But if you pump up the wrong thing, it goes backwards, it doesn't go forwards. And also, if you ruin it at the front, no one's going to be, let's repeat it and make it bigger. No, it's not going to happen. And biodiversity needs this money. So it's really important we just do a good job, really. And so that does mean, although it might not be kind of the flavor of the sales pitch, it means recognizing that biodiversity credits in an offset context, they're probably never going to be really accurate. But there are things you can do to mitigate the damages to deliver what is otherwise an essential pool of capital towards biodiversity. And this is where the big stress comes around voluntary credit markets and the more sort of nationally regulated offsetting schemes, which unhelpfully sometimes are also called biodiversity credits. And so everyone's like, what's a biodiversity credit? That's like, it's a great question, actually. It's really difficult to answer. And biodiversity is locally relevant. You can't say that a field or a forest structure in the UK has similar kinds of, value than in the Congo. Biodiversity is not kind of tradable at all, but definitely not at that kind of context where we have to have traits in biodiversity. It makes sense. It's one of these kind of conditions for making it relevant that it's as locally specific as is possible, which really promotes itself towards these nationally regulated markets. And I know that will kind of kill some more private thinkers on here. But it is really important if what you really care about is your biodiversity impact. If that's the thing you're looking to really nail down, and you're looking to say that the losses are more or less kind of commensurable to the benefits, then keeping that as locally specific to the ecosystem, the local relevance is really important, given the fact that where you're bringing back nature is in a place where nature is likely to thrive as well. If you're, demolishing the last sort of remnants in the middle of a city and then you plant some hedges around a city. I mean, there are challenges at a really fine spatial scale. But when we get really concerned is when the voluntary, at least where I get concerned, is when the voluntary biodiversity credit market could be considered an offsetting, which would in many cases say, hey, we're looking to find a unit of nature that is not just relevant for trading at a local scale designed to cap this imperfect need. But we can scale the trade of credits across ecosystems, across countries, across continents even, which for me says, well, this is not really about biodiversity anymore. This is about just trading in a thing, because we're really moving far away from what the point of these markets are, which is fundamentally to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. That's the point of them, and at that scale, I would question whether that's that's achievable. these bans do slightly loosen under a contribution-based approach. I say slightly loosened because it's not going to be cowboys in the far west. It is important to acknowledge the mitigation hierarchy, but because you're not saying that these gains are, impact or they are commensurable with losses, you have slightly more freedom to kind of get it wrong. I think, and this is where I think the voluntary market's really interesting for me. It's a really interesting sort of test bed and a learning bed, a place for innovation where the impact of getting it wrong is kind of on the investor as opposed to on nature. Because we're not saying that the damages are going to be equal to any benefits. So the benefits are benefits alone, and the costs are going to be borne by the thing that doesn't work. So and that's how this should work more for me, to have that chance to improve the innovative structures by how we think about biodiversity. I think this is kind of where these things kind of conflate and where it becomes really interesting and the importance to distinguish between these markets and the value of biodiversity nationally, internationally, and what are the scales? Because it does impact what we're talking about, really.
When it comes to scale and this idea of biodiversity credit trading across national or international borders, I would imagine, I mean, two problems come to mind. The one is the non interchangeability of biodiversity and ecosystems, right? And how do you compare an ecosystem in South Africa with one in the UK, for example? But then the other one would be sort of, I guess, equity comes into it as well, right? Because you could be sort of mining in the Congo and then restoring something in the USA, right? Which already has plenty of money to do that. So I would imagine, so there's more of a statement than a question, but are those kind of the two main issues, which are very broad groups of issues, or is there anything else that I've really missed out there?
There is more than just two problems with thinking about internationally traded biodiversity credits. Those are the two big ones. And I think fundamentally, and I know that it's very easy to kind of miss because it's so granular, and it's a bit boring, but it's in the case of it's offsetting. It's sort of saying that the damages here are equal to the benefits here.
Hmm.
And unless we're really, really careful about the words that we use here, you're going to end up with a system designed for an improvement, financing losses, legitimized losses.
Hmm.
And that's what everyone's really concerned about here because when I first really began working in this, I was so excited about these markets. I was like, goodness me, we're going to have so many more national markets. With the EU's sort of offsetting market coming in, it's going to be fantastic. The world is coming around to biodiversity, this thing which we can't define. Wow, what a huge leap by humanity to even consider this. I can't wait. And then we began really looking at how these things function. And when you're brought closer to the details, you see where the devil lives. And you just can't and you can't ignore it if what you care about is the overall impact on biodiversity, which is what these markets are for, and we should always remind ourselves of that. So for me, that's like the huge caveat is I am so up for innovation and creativity and change and entrepreneurship. But if we're in this phase of heavy development, you can't say in any way, shape, or form that you are making an impact relative to a loss because it is disingenuous and damaging. And I also don't think that I mean, from a background in sort of private industry, I don't think that any other business would work like this. You would never say this thing that we don't really know if it works or not is equal to the thing that we know a lot more. That we're very, very comfortable with understanding the damages that it causes. You would never level those things together until you were certain that the benefits that you have in the gains are really, really what you thought they were and they're robust because it's not stable as an investment. But if what you're looking for is like this creativity and innovation space, which is designed to kind of travel money to the areas that need it most, yeah, I think the voluntary market is super exciting. How it generates demand, I've no clue, but I'm also fascinated in that.
Can you say a little bit about, you know, with the voluntary market and the regulatory side of things? Because, at the moment, I mean, offsets are required by regulation, by law in many
Yeah.
countries around the world. So where do voluntary markets come into the equation, and how big a portion are they at the moment?
Yeah, great question. The portion of them is like zero, fundamentally. And I really feel that regulation is a huge enabler of these things to grow from a range of different perspectives. Um, from one view, if we know that the big driver of demand for these products is really because you have to buy them, then regulation is the oxygen for the market. And if there's no regulation which point towards a voluntary credit market, then it's not that there's no demand because clearly there is. I think that the market was sort of worth like $8 million last, or I think 2013, or I forget the specific numbers now, but it's like there's no demand and there's loads of growth in it. And there's clearly lots of lots of investments looking to kind of get these things really going, but it's not a really clear pipeline of demand that's in what you have in that regulatory driver. And so you need it for kind of market confidence, I would say almost at this point, to really get us going. And also to really govern what the usage of this looks like. As I mentioned before, the problems with using a potential biodiversity credit in a voluntary market as an offset, you need a little bit of parenting to make sure that we use them properly. Because your investors can't be expected to know everything. This stuff is really, really granular. And so we just need a bit of a regulatory body. It's not a big ask, I don't think, really, but also regulation is going to form, I think, a really, really important part of hopefully, and this is where we move into theoretical thinking land, of improving what I think is a really important market, because it's very, very easy following like a chain of logical thinking to see how, well, biodiversity credits are fundamentally driven by regulation. These regulations are prevalent mostly in UK, States, Australia, Canada. We're much more comfortable with restoration-based projects than avoided loss or sort of conservation-based projects due to the whole counterfactual debacle of what
Mhm.
does impact look like? We can't see it. And following this chain of where markets work best, you fundamentally end up with markets that promote restoration in countries of higher wealth, where the biodiversity's kind of been gone relative to where it was. And the thing that is most taking away all the markets, taking away all the finance, if you ask any conservationists what they would probably prefer to do, it's protecting what we've still got in their really, really valuable pockets because they're so hard to construct and to bring back. I'm not sure if anyone could write down what a particular rainforest looks like step by step for a rebuild. I don't think that exists. I think there's lots of hope and optimism are kind of really important here because it is sort of possible that these markets have lots or likely these might have lots and lots of failure over the few years. And when that failure is leveled with definite losses, it's a massive problem and it can kill the market. There are examples of this working. There are examples of offsetting schemes that work. There are examples of sort of optimism, really. But it does make sense to not just think about how can the market operate most efficiently, how can the demand best come in, how can we make sure that there's oxygen in the fire. It's like, is the solution pointing in the right direction? Or is this market just supporting the thing that we might not need more than the other one? And of course, it's important to point out here that biodiversity credit revenue or wildlife bonds or whatever it is, they're not the only ways of generating money for conservation. Bilateral, multilateral donations are going to continue to be essential. Where you have a fundamentally valued product, which is hard to define, yeah, might not work best for the private market because it's going to say, well, what are you talking about? It doesn't mean that it's not important. And so for me, it's not a case of it's credits or nothing. It's a
Mhm.
case of let's not change what we have now. It's essential. It's not enough though, so let's continue to build upon it. So yeah, I think no one's suggesting that these things are the only way forward and this is the only hope going forward. But I think we're hoping that the private markets carry more of the weight, considering the fact they contribute most of that weight.
Harrison, something I should have asked you earlier on. I'm just thinking about the listener who is the least familiar with this concept, and I thought that an example might be a good way to illustrate kind of what we're talking because we're speaking fairly theoretical at the moment. So, is there anything, perhaps something that you're working on at the moment? Just an example of biodiversity credits in action, and of course, it can be an offset example, which it probably would be, right?
Well, actually, my doctorate is linked to sort of a non-offset based project that we're looking to develop, and I think this actually leans into an area that I really care a lot about in terms of how markets can be used not just to uh, conserve nature or restore it, but also think about what a long-term future can look like. So, in an area where perhaps you're facing particular pressure towards a species, and that species is kind of is in decline, we would say, well, we need some money here to think about what a correction would look like, and also that damage has to be honest. It has to be a real damage. It can't just be a gamified. Well, I'm going to do some bad things to legitimize my business case. It has to be a genuine concern towards a particular area, ecosystem. In my case, it's actually a key species. And then we'd look to basically design or leverage a methodology, which is being
Hmm.
listed to think about, well, what are your key metrics for success relative to your interventions? And then you would track success against those things. When you achieve a certain level of success against the methodology, those scores are then verified. Your sort of final outcome, if you like. So that's the work that you do is your output. Your as a conservation practitioner, you would do things, your work output. Perhaps you're, I don't know, tracking some species. The outcome would be that you identify more problems, or you discover more snares, or you discover more poisonings. So that'd be your outcome of your output. And then perhaps the impact at the end would be what that means on your species health, or things like this.
Hmm.
Um, which is a very kind of unfair, realistic example because species specific credits kind of aren't really in existence. But that's kind of one of the things that I'm working on. And so fundamentally, then you have credits that are released relative to the improvement that you have. Those credits are then bought by markets. And the challenge is where your impact isn't right, where you say that you've released perhaps more credits than the credits that where you say that you're selling more value than what you really delivered. You have what we call in markets a case of over issuance, whereby investors are really buying things that aren't real. And that's why, especially in the offset context, credits have become quite controversial. And listeners may be more familiar with the $1 billion wiped off the voluntary credit market last year. But basically, as a function of really solid scientific evidence that projects were selling more value than perhaps what they were really carrying out. Because in the case of avoided loss or a conservation-based approach, they were predicting in their alternative counterfactual scenario that the losses would be catastrophic
Hmm.
relative to what was really going to happen in the absence of their intervention. And so by doing something, that difference becomes huge, and they can really commodify on that value. And the fake value in that is what we'd call kind of overissuance, and that threatens the legitimacy and the reliability of these markets. And that's what you saw the whole kind of price fall off over.
And then on the other hand, looking at the public reaction to this kind of thing, there is kind of I detect very often a knee-jerk opposition, especially among environmentally minded members of the public, to
Yeah.
any kind of market-based mechanism. So, what do you think are the barriers in terms of ideology and how do you get past that one? So, assuming, as you said earlier, that this is kind of a necessary evil, right? How do we keep it going and get past unnecessary barriers, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would caveat that really strongly by saying, I know I'm not a political commentator, and it's straying into difficult territory. Doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it though, because my background is very much in private markets. My current life is in the middle of this mixture between credit markets and academia and whatever. So I'm kind of well placed to see how these different parties think. And fundamentally, you're asking for two, generally speaking, groups of people to get along that largely don't love each other. And that's really difficult. And also the big group, the finance group, who kind of the conservationists would to some degree point a finger at for all of the damages that nature has in the world, and us saying, hey, we're gonna just fix all this stuff now, so don't worry about it. And the conservationists are saying, well, hey, we don't really trust you very much. In fact, we feel a bit more strongly than just that. And so there's a huge amount of bridge building that goes on here. And given how technical these products are, and given how nuanced they are, and given the potential damages that could arise from their incorrect kind of use case, I feel, and I know that others feel this way. I spend all day reading this stuff, and my big thing is I still am, not sure how transparent all of these products really are and how clear they are.
Hmm.
Um,
Measurement is really difficult, right? And even that $1 billion that was written off, who's to say that that's accurate? Maybe it should have been 2 billion or half a billion, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that the measurement in kind of carbon is everything's riddled with errors. You're absolutely correct, but I imagine that the error rate on carbon is a lot lower than it is on biodiversity. I mean, demonstrably lower. You can kind of track it. Biodiversity is changing all the time. It's a nightmare to measure. I mean, whether you should even try and measure a biodiversity, it doesn't even make sense when you say it out loud. So you know, I think for these markets to progress, and you need both parties to come together on this. And this is kind of something that I'm looking to really unify during my doctorate is you have to have the finances. You need them. They've got the money, they can scale stuff. But You would never try and build a house without great builders and great architects to understand how your house works. And that's the conservation scientists. The parties have to come together on this. And for them to come together and to kind of reconcile that ideological distrust, we have to be really clear about how these products work and how they don't work. For me, I feel calling out the obvious things is the best way to get around this. If we're saying that this product is designed for this particular use case, we're expecting problems here, here, and here. By the way, we're also looking to reconcile these problems progressively, and here are our thoughts around it. Yeah, you're going to have some people that are ideologically opposed to being engaged in these markets. You're going to have that for forever, by the way. But I think you're going to win over a lot more by being honest and transparent. And I think that works both ways as well, actually. I think that the conservation side need to be a bit more open to engaging in private market interest, being open to engaging in innovation. And I have the real benefit of coming from a firm where the outside view perhaps isn't that they care a lot about nature. From working inside that firm, I know that there are people there who care incredibly about biodiversity. And so those perceptions of differences often aren't, I don't think, the real differences between these groups. And so the more we kind of are clear about the things we're saying, we're transparent ideas and the problems, the more those perceived barriers begin to whittle away a little bit from me, and you have the chance to work together. And without an interdisciplinary solution here, we haven't even begun talking about how these products interact with the communities that live in these landscapes, which is
Hmm.
essential for long run conservation impact. These products just aren't going to work in the way that I think everyone wants them to, fundamentally, because the more impact they have on biodiversity, the more returns they have, the more everyone is kind of satisfied towards, more of a degree. It definitely starts with addressing the elephant in the room, clear, transparent communication to build trust and collaborative working.
And speaking of people, who do you think should actually be receiving the funds that biodiversity credits generate? And again, here, transparency and trustworthiness comes into it because how do you know, who are going to be the most effective recipients?
Yeah, and I there's no one answer here. It'll be so case by case specific. The people that put up the risk to make this project worthwhile, they deserve some money from doing this. This is not for free. This is not a charitable based approach. Those exist and they're really important, but this isn't that. You also have people who are carrying out the literal intervention work. They deserve to have revenue from this. You have people on the ground who are either engaged in the work or affected by the work. They need a cut of the money from this, or your project won't work. It's also morally essential. You have people that sell these credits and join the bridges, and they deserve a cut because otherwise, if your thing doesn't sell, no one else gets a chance to have some revenue. So you do have to look at this a little bit with an adult lens that says, yeah, there are many different actors in these products which deserve a cut of the revenue. The big question is, where does most of it go? And is that relative to the value that they have? And I think this is where there's more nuance in the discussion. What you can see at the moment is that lots of the revenue from these credits is kind of lost towards the sales and the operational market-based approaches, whereby people who are actually on the ground delivering the work, fundamentally building the credit, you could argue they definitely don't get the lion's share relative to what a benefit looks like in those landscapes. And for me, that's where it should start. Fundamentally, if you are selling a product where people who are building it are not accurately or suitably as measured by their feelings, and sometimes people want to get paid more, but unless people are being really sensibly compensated for what's happening, then the thing that you're going to be selling is going to be kind of rubbish, especially
Mhm.
over time. So for me, as long as the core team or the core affected peoples are getting suitably remunerated as agreed by the contract, which should be put in place, and suitable freer, prior, informed consent processes, and the design of these products follow like a bit of a human rights-based approach, which sounds a bit wish-washy from the outside perspective, but is otherwise fundamentally an incredibly pragmatic and sensible approach to engage people in these landscapes. Everything else comes after getting this right. This has to be right. If the core of it is good, then the scale has a chance of working. If the core of it is bad, then scaling is probably going to scale a bad outcome.
Yeah, I just, we spoke about a couple of problems about that cross-national trading of credits. I can see another possible one being the amount of leakage that could happen when you've got big conservation organizations, for example, not based in the place where the restoration or the conservation needs to happen. I mean, I know these organizations are generally doing very good work, but there's a fair amount of wastage.
There is, without question, a disconnect between in the credit markets, the groups that design how these things should function and the teams that deliver them on the ground. There's no question. Anyone that does any conservation work on the ground will be quick to tell you how unique their case study system is, how specific it is, how valuably specific it is, by the way, and the role of all of the things that probably aren't accounted for in a methodology are in the doing of their work. And often it's a lot of human stuff. It's a lot of trust-based. You're running a project. It's not always about, the science at that local scale and a better understanding of what it takes to actually really manage a product, to manage what it looks like around your field site area. To your point, your leakage. Are we just going to push the problem left by a couple of 100 kilometers? Or are we also thinking about how those communities could be maybe engaged or they understand or these things really it depends so much on the developer. And there's a huge disconnect. When you're designing things from a different country, you're never going to nail it in the context of the place. And as a conservation scientist, when you're going in to deliver or conduct your research, I think increasingly now, at least with my work and others that I'm inspired by, the problems are co-defined. They are really worked with local communities. What are the problems that you're really facing here? And that doesn't mean that you don't go in with your prior objectives, your prior knowledge, your prior thinking. It just means that you're informed by kind of the locally specific challenges. And then you design a solution with the people, which means that there's a better chance of it being adopted. You don't have to force it. I mean, you probably shouldn't force it anyway, but it's going to be adopted. Others around might also feel it's valuable. They might want to adopt it. They might trust you. Even if your idea is perfect before you go there, quite often, if you don't engage people in that process, people don't want to support your idea that wasn't also their idea as well. And so, yeah, an approach which doesn't really consider a co-design in an area which affects people, it's really, really difficult to say that that scales. And there's a disconnect.
Mm. Another question, which I think you suggested we chat about, is human-wildlife conflict. How does this fit into market-based conservation or restoration, and how do we avoid the funding of conflict between wildlife and communities? Obviously, it would be unintentionally done, right? But it could end up being the result.
Yeah.
And perhaps related to that, how important is land and wildlife ownership for the communities engaged in these credits? So we're talking about the implementers just now, but communities themselves are very often the implementers, as well as the people who are most strongly affected by whatever is implemented.
So I think for me, conflict, yeah, really, really important. But for me, it's more coexistence, which is like a broader thing than just conflict. Um, and how do markets contribute towards this? Well, in the UK where I'm sitting here, the wildlife doesn't necessarily present much of a threat to my livelihood or my health. But I'm doing my field work in Tanzania, where the wildlife it looks quite different. And some of it, whilst it's very enjoyable and charismatic from 1,000 miles away, is terrifying up close. And the value that I associate with some of these beautiful wildlife is very different to the kind of direction of value that sometimes local communities will have towards these things.
Mm.
If all of the money that you have in the world is invested, let's say, in your cattle, and you live amongst your cattle, and then some big predator comes along and eats a portion of your cattle, you're looking at a bank hacker in our context. We don't like them very much. So very unintentionally, when and these areas of the world, and it's not just about sub-Saharan Africa, you can kind of apply this anywhere with wildlife that causes damages. They often kind of conflate with areas of biodiversity loss, and so they need attention, they need financing. And so if we're looking to bring back biodiversity that could come at a cost to humans where it isn't currently, or you want to keep it around amongst these people, to me, it is a very logical inference to say this might have a negative cost actually on people around here, and humans are with agency, whether legally or illegally, and that will come into how successful your wildlife project is
Mm.
or your biodiversity project is. And so I don't think these markets are considering this to a suitable degree. And I think that it's important not just because moral human sort of safeguards and security, but it's important because of the permanence of your project. And also, it's not just the case that these communities represent like a negative impact. They can underpin the success of conservation interventions as well. So it's a proper pendulum swinger.
Mm.
And of course, it's really difficult to manage projects and nuance arrives. And things like land tenure and accountability and responsibility are essential. The three kind of spheres of equity, recognitional, procedural, distributional. So Are they recognized as valuable stakeholders? Are they engaged suitably in the design, the management, and the rollout of the projects? Do they receive the money from those in a way which is equitable for perhaps the groups that are engaged, that are affected by the program?
Hmm.
Really, really hard to nail down, really difficult, but essential. And we mustn't be overwhelmed by the complexity of these problems in the face of solution that the world really needs around this. And so I would love to shift the dial towards at least really considering what coexistence means in the landscapes where most money really needs to go to protect the things that are at real risk of disappearing. And so yeah, I would say that this kind of challenge is not really being considered, and it really should be. It is very easy to not really look and see, hey, are these programs really doing what we want them to do? Um, and then there are other complexities here around the verification and who pays for the verification and what the motivations are for verification. All these things which kind of impact how we think about what quality looks like when we're buying these things in different places where we've got no idea what the project work looks like on the ground. And with kind of the deep uncertainty that comes around measuring things like biodiversity, nailing a good project design in a way that is, equitable and otherwise just pragmatically sensible has to be your starting point.